Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. As folks know, because I keep telling them, we are racking and stacking episodes so that I can leave town. And I had something on the books for a very long time, and then realized that it was when I was like literally going to be en route to the old world. And so out of a great graciousness and generosity of spirit, Matt Lewis agreed to record on a Saturday. So we were recording on Saturday afternoon at 3:00 in the afternoon. But I wanted to have him on for a long time. A lot of listeners were appalled when they found out that he'd never been on. And then he came out with it announced that he was working on this book. And I was like, all right, when the book comes out, we have to have him on. So he's on. The book is coming out. Probably by the time you hear this, it'll be out. Certainly, most important thing, it'll be purchasable wherever you find quality books. And the book is Filthy Rich Politicians, the Swamp Creatures, Latte Liberals, and Ruling Class Elites Cashing In on America. Matt Lewis, who's also a senior columnist for the Daily Beast, welcome to the Remnant.
Hey, Jonah, good to be here.
I hope that wasn't too much throat clearing of an intro for you, but I figured I'd just get it all out there, just lay my cards on the table.
I'm glad that all of my patched through phone calls and letters to the editor and my campaign to get on the Remnant finally paid off.
Yeah, it was weird that all the handwritten notes had the same handwriting. And kudos to you for driving to all those different zip codes to mail them from different places. All right, so the official first question in a situation like this is, what's your book about?
So it's about how the rich get elected and the elected get rich. And, I think both questions and both topics are interesting. Obviously, the latter part is more, I think, important, right? The sense that politicians are using their perch to feather their nest is, I think, corrosive. There's a sense out there that the game is rigged. I think this is contributing to the lack of trust in institutions and elected officials. So I think this is a serious thing. I try to write the book is hopefully kind of fun and funny, but it's a serious topic. I think that whether it's things like insider trading, spreading the wealth around to family members, or the revolving door of going into lobbying, or just the fact that your average member of Congress of the lower house, the House of Representatives, your average member of Congress is 12 times richer now than the average American citizen. Like, I think all of these things are combining to kind of persuade a lot of Americans that the game is rigged.
Yeah. So I like the way you phrased it about how the rich get elected and the elected get rich, because they're not necessarily the same thing, right? I mean, like, there's a vulgar Marxist, habit in American politics that they think that the really rich politicians do everything in politics to get richer, when in reality, that doesn't really work with a lot of human psychology or sociology. Is like, once you have $250 million in FU money, if you wanted 500 million, you would have stayed in the business that you were in. You wouldn't have gone into politics. So going into politics for a lot of these people is a vanity play or a patriotic play, right? I mean, there can be both, but it's like people who thought that Dick Cheney was orchestrating the Gulf War to make money off of oil just completely misunderstood Dick Cheney's psychology and how these things kind of work. But at the same time, it seems to me like if you don't have a lot of money, it must be really hard to resist legal, we'll get to the illegal stuff in a minute, legal opportunities to get rich by virtue of your status as a politician. And that's a lot of what's in the book. I mean, I was going through the book and there's just a lot of that. The scandal is not what's illegal, but what's legal kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. Almost everything is legal. It's like the banality of, politics or something. Most of the way that politicians get rich is perfectly legal, or gray areas. I hardly even touch on like outright illegal things in this book. Because obviously it's like, that's not a problem. It's already illegal. Maybe we need to enforce them better. The things in this book are generally things that are very perfectly legal. Look, so why do rich people run for office? I think it's rarely the nefarious thing that some people think about. I think that, there's the transitive property of expertise. They think that because they've been really successful in one industry, military, business, whatever, they can apply that to politics. I think it's also the same reason that rich people buy, rocket rides or media outlets or sports teams, right? They're bored and or they want to give back. So I think there's like a lot of pretty good reasons, actually. Now that like they may be misguided. And again, it may be that that they really don't know what they're doing in politics. But I think a lot of it is admirable. And in fact, I think like if I were super rich, I think I'd probably be on a beach drinking pina coladas. Like, I don't know if I'd want to give back to the degree that some of these people do. So I don't necessarily think it's like inherently bad. I will say one thing is that you kind of have to be rich to get elected to that. Like I was talking, my wife is a Republican political fundraiser whose clients include, many famous conservative Republican politicians. And we live in West Virginia. And a few months ago, when I was writing this book, we were going for a walk. And I was saying, like in West Virginia, my congressman is running for the Senate seat against Joe Manchin. So there's an open House seat. And I was saying, if I couldn't run right now, I could not run for Congress in West Virginia because I'm not Trumpy enough. But I was saying, in a different world, maybe I could be running for this seat. And my wife is like, oh no, you couldn't. You don't have enough money. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I've been in politics for 15 years. I've got a lot of friends, and you're a professional fundraiser. How can you say that? And she's like, well, if you came to me and asked me to raise money for you, I would tell you, come back and talk to me when you have either $300,000 that you are willing to self-fund, or if you can raise from your own Christmas card list $300,000, then we can start to talk about me fundraising, introducing you to lobbyists or PACs. So I think that's another part of it. It's that you kind of nowadays have to be rich to run. And even, Jonah, even the populists, like Marjorie Taylor Greene is worth $5 million, right? So that's kind of the world that we're in.
Yeah. So, but when you say almost everything is legal, I wasn't trying to say that you were exposing lots of crimes, although some of the Darrell Issa stuff,
never been convicted.
Never convicted. Yeah. It's sort of like in Stripes when they say, have you ever been convicted for a major crime? Convicted? No, not convicted. But the Denny Hastert thing that I don't know if these days, I'm sure you have this experience as we become elder statesmen, is you read things and you're shocked by them. And then you have to ask yourself, did I know that and forget it? Or did I never know it? But the thing about Hastert, you have this thing in there about Hastert going in with some buddies in his district for a buying land with some sort of blind trust LLC type thing, knowing that he was going to put through an earmark that put through federal funding for highway stuff that was going to wildly increase the value of the land. Is that legal? Am I getting the facts right? A, and B is can congressmen, forget that earmarks are kind of discontinued, but not whatever. But let's say earmarks were still around. Was it legal then?
My understanding is yes. Certainly unethical. And in my book, we actually talk about legal graft. So look, is it possible that someone could dig up some obscure way that they could have prosecuted Hastert for doing this? Possibly. But by and large, this was how the game was played. And there's weird stuff. You may know this, Jonah, but I think a lot of our listeners probably don't realize that until 1981, this is a different topic, but interesting to me. If you were a member of Congress, you could raise millions of dollars for your campaign, and then you could retire and you could keep that money. personally. You didn't have to give it away to charity. You didn't have to give it to other campaigns. So it was the Wild West. And I realized Denny Hastert it's only been 10 or 15 years ago or something that he was speaker, I guess 15 years that he was speaker of the House. It feels like a million years ago, but, he did, and by the way, he needed the money, right? He needed the money because it turns out he was actually paying off a, person that he had allegedly molested. I think allegedly, maybe not even allegedly.
I don't think we have to say allegedly anymore, right?
I'm so used to saying it, but apparently he had been. So.
Well, because in part, first evidence against saying allegedly is he paid the guy to keep it quiet. And then he went to jail for various things like that. So, all right. So walk me through how Harry Reid got so rich.
Well, by the way, I thought it was interesting, right? Harry Reid, former Senate Majority Leader, Denny Hastert, former House Speaker around the same time. I don't even know that I could walk you through how Harry Reid got rich. It is incredibly complicated, but it is very, very sketchy. And he's never really been held account to it. I think Sharon Angle, who ran against him like in 2010 or something, tried to bring it up. That's one of the interesting things is it almost never works, even though I argue that this behavior, land deals, as was the case with Harry Reid and Denny Hastert, I think is corrosive and undermines trust in our institutions and our elected officials. The voters very rarely will actually punish a politician for doing it. Harry Reid, it's a very complex deal, but essentially it's in the same neck of the woods as Denny Hastert. It's using his position, knowing inside information about land speculation and then profiting wildly off of it and never being held accountable.
So in most of these cases, is it how much of it is insider information and how much of it is, hey, look, I'm the chief investment officer for the local bank, and I got some real estate guys. One guy owns part of a mall, another guy owns some restaurants, and blah 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 blah. And we want to develop something down by the waterfront, and having a congressman or a senator as part of the investor group is going to get everyone to return our phone calls, is going to get every bureaucrat to sort of think twice about drowning us in red tape. And so it's not insider information. It's just having insider flex to as a sort of for bragging rights and also sort of for keeping the wheels moving. How much of it is that kind of thing, and how much of it is, hey, I know the government is about to do something, I can monetize it?
Well, I think that there are these gray areas, right? And it's seductive and tempting. And I think that what you're just describing is kind of what I would call like old school corruption. The big deal right now, Jonah, I think, is insider trading in the stock market. And let me give you a couple examples of Nancy Pelosi that I think will speak to the question. So in 2020, her husband, it's never Nancy Pelosi, by the way, who does the trading. It's Paul Pelosi. And we have to take their word that there's no pillow talk or she doesn't tell him anything. So in 2020, Paul Pelosi basically buys options of hundreds of thousands of dollars of Tesla stock. 5 weeks later, just 5 weeks later, after buying these call options, Joe Biden signs an executive order announcing that we're going to transition our fleet, state, local, federal fleets to zero emissions vehicles. You can imagine what happened to the price of Tesla stock, right? It went up big time, right? So maybe that's a coincidence, okay? 1 year later, Paul Pelosi exercises options on, I think it was $10 million of Microsoft stock. This time, it's 2 weeks later, the U.S. Army announces that they're going to do a deal with Microsoft. So Microsoft is going to provide the augmented reality headsets for the U.S. Army. Now we're talking about possibly billions of dollars over the next decade. So I think the land speculation is kind of quaint. You know, the stuff that like Harry Reid and Denny Hastert, that's kind of like, I mean, there's actually an old episode of Andy Griffith where like the mayor is, like buying land by the highway or something, and it's kind of laughed off by Andy and Barney. I mean, that's quaint. I think the big thing now has been insider trading the stock market, and actually cryptocurrency, maybe the cutting edge thing that Madison Cawthorn, the former first-term member of Congress, was speculating there. But it's not. So in 2012, Congress passed the Stock Act, which technically made it illegal. It wasn't illegal before, but it's illegal now to engage in insider trading in Congress. But the problem is, God bless you, the problem is it's nearly impossible to police.
Yeah, I mean, it's nearly impossible to police given the way the law is written now, right? Because like this is one of the only areas where I am kind of Elizabeth Warren-y about anything I can think of, right? And in part, it's because I have some friends who are in like private equity and Wall Street stuff, and they are absolutely scandalized by how the regulations on them about insider trading and full disclosure and keeping, and separating, different sources of information and different divisions that are working with different all this kind of stuff, right? Like I have one friend who's a big GOP donor who just won't give to state politicians because New York State's rules about giving to politicians if you have potentially economic interests based in that state for whatever reason, like you have to do 10 times more disclosure. He just doesn't do it, right? And so it's just for federal officers. Anyway, my point is, he always used to say to me, he's like, look, like I get some of these rules. I think some of them are really bad, but like there are all these rules about how I deal with insider information if I should get it. And the people who create the insider information, literally like the people who award the contracts, who write the regulations, who can, with the tiniest change in wording in a regulation or a law, or even just by issuing a press release sometimes, can move the market in significant ways. They're allowed to buy stocks. And I don't get it. I mean, like, why can't congressmen and senators put them in, just index them to the what is it? The NASDAQ or whatever.
You're getting ahead of me. My sequel is going to be Filthy Rich Bureaucrats. So it's a whole bunch of people who are cashing in.
Oh, so is there actual evidence of like bureaucrats making money off of this stuff?
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. I thought you were teasing me about something very exciting there. No, but I don't get the argument for why on the merits. I don't get the argument. I get the argument that all of Nancy Pelosi's and Kevin McCarthy's, conference members would lose their gourds if you tried to tell them that they couldn't trade stocks anymore. But I don't get why. I mean, anyway, I'm on Team AOC on this kind of stuff, and it makes me uncomfortable. So I'm always looking for a reason to get off.
Well, no, and so it's interesting. I'm there. I'm with you there, Jonah, on that. And I'll tell you what's interesting to me about. Let me say the name of the book, Filthy Rich Politicians, which is available now. Please get it. The thing about Filthy Rich Politicians is that some people will probably think, oh, Matt Lewis has gone all populist now. Like he's on that populist bandwagon. But as I noted sort of at the top of the show, my whole premise for this is not that I want to like start a revolution against the bourgeoisie. It's I want to preserve this miracle, as someone might call it. I believe that we have a great country and a great system, and I also believe that one of the things that's contributing to undermining trust in the system, in the institution, and in the elected officials is the sense that the game is rigged. And we need to have some, I think, reforms to bolster the system. So I would ban the trading of stocks. I don't think members of Congress should be trading stock. Now, if you want to own a mutual funds, that's perfectly fine, right? But you shouldn't be trading stock because if nothing else, there's the appearance of impropriety. I mean, and this is bipartisan. I could tell you Republican stories too. But whether Nancy Pelosi was engaging in insider trading or not, it looks swampy. It looks sketchy. It undermines trust in politics. And so I don't look, if nobody's telling you have to go to Congress, you don't have to be a congressman. I don't think it's asking too much that while you are here, while you're serving we the people, that you refrain, you and by the way, you and your spouse refrain from betting on the stock market.
All right, so let's talk about the Bidens for a second as a brief segue into ranker punditry. I just wrote recently that I've kind of kept my powder dry on all of this because there are a bunch of things that I think every reasonable person, regardless of party, like there's no Democrat I've met in the CNN green room who hasn't said, yeah, the Hunter stuff looks bad. You know, I mean, like everybody can agree on that, right? And everyone can agree that Hunter's somewhere between a tragic and a villainous, you know, creature, broken person, lots of demons, lots of mistakes, corrupt in a lot of different senses. I don't think anybody can dispute any of that. How much of it do you think actually touches Joe Biden himself? And how do you think they have handled the optics of it?
I think that I'll put on my rank punditry cap right now.
Yeah. We'll switch the author cap back on in a second.
Okay.
Don't worry. Yeah.
All right. I like punditry. I actually think that they've handled it about as well as they could. Because I think Joe Biden, for whatever reason, has decided that there will, Hunter is his priority. And in a way, there's a noble part of that. But I think, if I were advising Joe Biden, like I wouldn't have had Hunter come to a state dinner, let's say, like maybe those aren't great optics on the heels of I guess it was on the heels of the story about Hunter Biden's out of wedlock child and Joe Biden not acknowledging.
Oh, I thought it was the day after they reached the plea deal.
Oh, that's right. Even worse. Right.
Yeah,
even
right.
Worse.
I think it's even worse, but
I mean, yeah, I guess
reasonable people will differ on that.
One has to do with kind of character and one has, well, they both do. Anyway, different, but horrible. But I don't think Joe Biden will change his mind on that. Like, I think Biden has kind of decided like Hunter, hell or high water. And again, there's something as a father of two boys, I really hope they turn out better than Hunter Biden, but there's something admirable about it. But look, what's interesting to me is that, Joe Biden for many years was one of the poorer members of Congress, at least according to his disclosure forms. Like if he's the quote unquote big guy and he's got secret bank accounts that we don't know about, I can't speak to that. But he really seemed to cash in right after he left the vice presidency. He made about $15 million and on things like, again, it's the banality of politics, right? He made money on things like book deals, being a professor, giving speeches, like that kind of stuff. He cashed in. But Joe Biden has a history of spreading the wealth around to his family and for his family cashing in. It's not just Hunter, right? He's got these two brothers, James and Frank. Both of them have been cashing in on the Biden name and on Joe's positions for decades. And I went back and looked. There's an article in the Atlantic that said that in 1988, when Joe Biden ran for president, he raised about $11 million. 20% of that money went to Biden family members or companies that they work for. So Biden may not have been that rich, but we're talking about like 25 or 30 years of his family profiting from Joe Biden's political career.
Yeah, I mean, so again, it's all conjecture here, right? I mean, that's not all conjecture, but it's like motives and what's going on behind the scenes is a lot of speculation. And I'm willing to give Biden the benefit of the doubt that this is about protecting Hunter. It is entirely possible that he could still not be criminal, right? It could still not be that Biden is taking bribes and all that kind of stuff. But this is more about protecting the name Biden in Biden's own mind, right? I mean, Biden...
And he may not be in, I don't want to say his right mind, but he may not be operating at 100%.
Yeah, he may not be his best self, yes. I think, right?
Well said.
So it's kind of like, I mean, I think this is true of all ethnicities, but there are a lot of examples of it in sort of culture and literature about Irish, right? You know, like you think of the Kennedys, this kind of thing where you know, like I remember Joe Biden saying, "I give you my word as a Biden," and thinking like, oh, he double dog dared us, right? No, I didn't. I was doubting him until he said he gave me his word as a Biden. And then I have no choice but to think he's telling the truth, right? And I don't know if he thinks that that's the way people actually hear it or if it's shtick. But I think he wants people to think that he, you know, that the Biden family is known for great honor and integrity and all of these kinds of things. And it's sort of like the Kennedys. I mean, it's like the Kennedys. And then the Bidens are no Kennedys, but like the Kennedys have this, the deepest Kool-Aid drinkers about the cult of the Kennedys are the Kennedys. And they can be furious at their own kids behind closed doors for making the name look bad, but they all rally around in public because for the good of the larger family name or the brand or whatever. And so it may be that Joe is disgusted and furious and belittles Hunter all the time in private, but they have to maintain appearances in public. I mean, we know that Donald Trump had a similar attitude. I mean, I'm not saying that we know this about Biden, right? But I think it's one of the plausible theories. You know, Donald Trump supposedly said to his wife, "I can't name Don Jr. because what if he turns out to be a loser?" You know, like some dads can be jerks like that. And again, we don't have evidence about Joe necessarily. We have some evidence that Joe might be a jerk. We don't have evidence that he's a jerk dad, which is a different thing.
I've tried to inculcate a little bit of this in my family in a slightly different way. I'm from a very kind of humble, working class, rural family. But I've got these two sons and I tried to how can I instill in them a sort of pride, like in a healthy way? And so I need to get back. I haven't done this in a while, but I used to say things like when you walk out of that door, you're representing not just you, but you're representing the Lewis family. And, this is total, I don't want to say total BS because this is true, but I'm literally going out of my way to create this sense of some nobility of being a Lewis. And so
I think that's entirely honorable and good parenting. I just want to be clear about that. But there's a difference between, no offense to you or to me, but we aren't ongoing political franchises. and I think, you're trying to teach them with a sense of intergenerational obligation and all that kind of stuff. The Kennedys in particular, but it's more of a don't screw with the brand kind of thing, because this is our business model going on. And again, I'm not saying I know this. I feel like it sometimes when that
happens when my sons start get on social media someday and start tweeting embarrassing things, and then that's when that's when I lower the hammer on them based on business interests. But
That's
for
right.
now, it's about nobility.
Yeah. When they start live tweeting how you behave at home.
Oh my God.
Not giving them any ideas.
So I don't want to be the whataboutism guy, but I can hear some of my Twitter followers saying, but what about Trump? So I do want to say that I don't know if you remember, like a month or two ago, there was a story about how House Republicans were investigating the Biden family, and they found these bank records where foreign countries were laundering millions of dollars to various Biden family members, and they were doing it in such a way that it looks very suspicious. They're obviously attempting to hide it. And if this turns out to be true, and it very well may, like, that is very concerning. And yet, worst case scenario, we're talking about like $10 million given to the Biden family. Whereas, in fairness, Jared Kushner secured this $2 billion investment into his private equity firm from a fund led by the Saudi crown prince. $2 billion. So once again, and I do not want to like diminish from the seriousness of our current president's appearance of impropriety. Once again, Trump trumps him, like, quantitatively and qualitatively.
No, and I have no dispute about that. And I think even before the Saudi, investment thing, just how much money they were making, Jared and Ivanka were making on the job, or Trump's refusal to sever his business ties, like he said he would. I mean, there are just a gazillion things where, or the truly grotesque sort of stuff with the hotel where everybody understood that you couldn't get a meeting, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, unless you stayed at his hotel and paid, excessive rates and all that kind of stuff. I think, but I mean, here, so it's funny. Oh, this was the question that before, and I don't know, we probably cut out my long pause, but to put your author hat back on, right? So, like, you said at the very beginning that weirdly, these kinds of conflicts of interest, unethical, but not necessarily illegal, just kind of gross business dealings, very rarely do politicians lose their jobs over it, which suggests that the voters, because you're saying on the one hand, this looks really bad, it erodes trust, blah, 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 which I totally agree with. I think it's a perfectly defensible, and correct position. But then on the other hand, the voters closest to the actual politician with the most power to actually do something about the specific politician who's doing these terrible things, they never vote them out of office. So, like, how do you reconcile this? It's like, people say you're trying to foment a populist uprising. Well, why aren't there many populist uprisings against the specific politicians? And then I'll tie this to Trump after you answer the question, because I have a connection.
Well, let me say about the populist uprising, I do believe it's important for all of us that we fix these problems. And if you're a rich person, you should really want to fix the populist uprising. And as I write in the book, not only do you not want the mob showing up at your door with torches and lanterns and pitchforks, it's much better to have them showing up with well-typed resumes. So that's kind of my vision. But look, just in the last election cycle, like in the 22 midterms, there were many examples of this. Daniel Goldman, who's heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, won a crowded Democratic primary in New York, even though, he'd never been elected to anything. Other candidates, I think, were more qualified for the position. He had the most money. They tried to use his wealth against him in the primary very explicitly. It obviously didn't work, right? John Hoeven, a U.S. senator from North Dakota, very, very wealthy, has in the decade or so that he's been in the U.S. Senate, he's doubled. He's gone from like 20 million to 40 million net worth. His opponents used it, didn't go anywhere, didn't matter. Don Beyer, they're in Northern Virginia. He's a big car dealer. By the way, a lot of these filthy rich politicians are car dealers, like a disproportionate number of them, and they almost all got PPP funding for what that's worth. If you want to, show up at his door with a lantern and a pitchfork. Don Beyer, this was used against him in his primary in 2022. Didn't go anywhere. Didn't work. Even I always thought a really interesting thing was George Santos, right? George Santos lied about a lot of stuff. So when it came to like his ethnic heritage and his sexual orientation, things like that, he really tried to stress his minority outsider status. But when it came to his pedigree and his wealth, he actually lied and overemphasized his wealth and sophistication and education and things like that. And so I do think it is this weird paradox, Jonah. And maybe it's as simple as the whole cliche about how people hate politics, hate Congress, but love their congressman. Like it may just be as simple as that. But for whatever reason, I think it is very clear that this sense that politicians are richer. Again, the average member of Congress is 12 times richer than the average American household. And it's not just me. There's data in my book to back it up. Things like Pew Research Center polls, Gallup polls. There is certainly evidence that this is eroding trust in the system. And yet, for whatever reason, and I'm speculating here, but we don't know, but it just seems very clear that if you're a political consultant and you're running against a rich guy, don't make a big deal out of it because it's probably not going to work, or at least it's not going to. The benefit, I'll put it to you this way: the benefits of being rich outweigh the potential PR downside of being rich.
Yeah. So the reason I brought this up is that I think because Riley's, for fear of getting what about it about Trump, he brought up Trump in comparison to Biden and all that. And I think that to a certain degree, first of all, it may turn out that none of these allegations hurt Joe Biden at all, right? I mean, in fact, we knew some of them going into the 2020 election and they didn't do anything, right? And I understand that there's a certain segment of the sort of Fox-aligned, audience that is obsessed with these allegations and thinks that they are just one bombshell after another, the sort of Mary Bartiromo caucus, right? And they may be right. Again, I'm keeping my powder dry, but I'm withholding every possibility that Biden is actually guilty of a lot of horrible, terrible things, because in this, at least in this regard. But it does feel like, to the extent that this stuff sticks more to Biden than it does to Trump, is because there's no hypocrisy in Trump about this. Trump basically nodded and winked and told people he was corrupt, and people assumed he was corrupt.
Honest liar is what Dave Chappelle said on SNL, and I think that was a brilliant observation. Yeah,
and meanwhile, Biden has this "I'm better than you, I'm honorable" kind of thing. And this is one of my great peeves of our culture, is that people are much more angry about hypocrisy than they are about actual bad behavior. And then maybe that's why it cuts differently for Biden than it does for Trump, or maybe not.
Well, I definitely think that it's true that, Donald Trump's credibility has never been based on integrity or character. And therefore, as the Eagles sang, I'm already standing on the ground. You can't let me down. I'm already on the ground, whatever that was. But look, I think there's another point here that ties into your question, the last question. And that's this. I think that our outrage receptors have been burned out, partly by Trump and partly by just the fact that Nancy Pelosi, the stuff that I described, or, the other thing is, Jonah, it's not. So the way that the insider trading works, it's kind of like steroids. OK, like in baseball, people think that if you take steroids, it's going to make the reason people think the reason players take steroids is that it's going to make them jack and hit the ball farther. And that does happen, but that's not the reason people take steroids. The real benefit to steroids is injury recovery. You recover from injuries much quicker. The same thing is true with insider trading in Congress. People think the reason you do insider trading is to make a lot of money. And that does happen, and it can happen. And I think the Pelosi's presumably have done that. But the real reason that you do insider trading is to not lose money. And so one of the things that I talk about in my book, Filthy Rich Politicians, that one's for Tevi Troy. One of the things I talk about is how, and I think this is really, really scummy and distasteful, but it's during times of crisis and great change that this really matters, right? So it's during the Obamacare battle, people cash in. During COVID-19 is a classic example, right? You have Senator Richard Burr. At the time, he's chair of the Intel Committee. So he's privy to all sorts of classified meetings and information that you and I didn't have, okay? So COVID is hitting. The average American, though, does not, at this point, did not realize how bad COVID was really going to be. So Burr dumps hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of stock in things like Wyndham hotels, right? The kinds of things that might not fare well in a global pandemic. Then here's the worst part. He picks up the phone and he calls his brother-in-law. Within 1 minute of hanging up the phone with Burr, his brother-in-law calls his broker and dumps like $100,000 or more worth of his stock. So that, I think, really erodes and disgusts people. And I guess here's my point, is that when Americans, I think right now we are fed up and we're past the point of being outraged. Right now, we're kind of apathetic about it. Like, we have accepted this. We have accepted this low-grade corruption as normal. And I think that kind of explains the situation. Like, when you are disgusted and you've given up, you may lose faith in liberal democracy, but that's not going to stop you from voting for your congressman, Don Beyer or John Hoeven, right? Because you need them to bring home the bacon to North Dakota or to whatever, even an ideological to do, to fight the left, to fight the trans community or whatever. So it is a weird paradox, but I do think that this is an important issue, and yet it doesn't show up at the ballot box.
So we were talking about this before, and this is a point I often bring up, is that people misuse the word oligarchy. I checked, you don't. I was worried I would have to correct you, but because oligarchy is rule of the few, it's not rule of the rich. And the problem is that the only time you ever hear of an oligarch is when they're crazy rich. So people understandably assume that oligarch means rich, basically because of Russia. Plutocracy is money, ruled by the richest, right? And but oligarch is just ruled by the few. And you could have a post-liberal integralist order where there were just a handful of cardinals who ran everything. I mean, there are all sorts of different things, and they wouldn't necessarily have to be rich. But the public choice theorist in me, to the extent such a homunculus exists, points out that the problem is that when you have rule of the few, it's really easy for the few to then get rich. And it's also much easier to become a member of the few if you are rich, right? And so that's sort of your point about, either the rich get elected and the elected get rich, which is a nice way of making the exact same point, which is why I liked it. But so I want to ask you sort of a sociological question. Of the things that truly offend you, right? Because you have to read all these case studies and you write them all up, and it's very easily. I highly recommend the book for people interested in this stuff because it's very readable. You can pick it up and put it down. It's a great book for index surfing the politicians you like the most or hate the most. But in totality, the people who did the ickiest stuff, were they already rich when they got to Congress? Or did they become, or public office? Were they already rich when they went for public office? Or did they become rich while in public office, right? So is it the strivers who really cut corners to get rich once they got in office? or is it the guys who were, who should have had some noblesse oblige, but just couldn't help themselves?
Well, it's a confusing question because they're almost all rich when they get there, right? So it's gradations. I would say the
but you say Marjorie Taylor Greene's worth $5 million. $5 million in terms of national aggregate statistics, that actually makes her rich and all that kind of stuff. But it's a difference in degree when you're talking about, like, so her house is probably worth like $1.5 million, and then she's got a business and whatever. It's different than, Daryl is, who's worth like $250 million or something like that, right? I mean, they're just different things.
I would say if I had to choose, that the filthiest, the people who come to Congress or the Senate with the most money, and by the way, so the richest politician in America right now is actually not in Congress. It's J.B. Pritzker, who is governor of Illinois. He's is heir to, I think it's the Hyatt fortune, one of 11 billionaires in his family. There were 3 billionaires who ran for governor of Illinois last cycle. Amazing. The richest, we believe, it's impossible to know exactly. Politicians find ways to hide and their net worth, but it seems like Rick Scott is probably the richest member of Congress right now. The way that he earned his money seems to have been in a somewhat sketchy, questionable way. But as far as I know, and I don't like his politics, but as far as I know, he's not cashing in his job, and the same thing. So I think if I had to choose, I would say it's more the strivers who are engaging in the bad behavior than the truly, like, people worth $100 million. Like, they probably don't really need to. They're making so much off of interest anyway.
Right. And even in the case of, and I think it's a really interesting point that had not occurred to me, is that most of the insider trading is a hedge against losses and not a search for windfall profits, which makes total sense once you say it. But I hadn't really thought about it. But if you're worth a couple $100 million, and if you do something shady to save yourself $5 million, which you can probably write off partly on your taxes anyway, it's the price of the scandal exceeds the value in your discretionary, wealth of taking the hit. But if you're someone who's came to Congress kind of middle class or middle class adjacent, and you've gotten rich, and now you're looking at losing a big chunk of it, you could see how you would be willing to take the hit in a way that, one of the mega rich wouldn't.
Yeah, I think it makes sense from a rational standpoint. And I have to say, so Jonah, one of the reforms that I call for in filthy rich politicians is I actually changed my mind on. But it sort of speaks to this point, and it's term limits. I used to be vehemently opposed to term limits. I've actually changed my mind on it. And I do think one of the if we had term limits, one of the things it would do would be mitigate the possibility that someone could really cash in over the course of many, many years off of their position.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm with you on that one. I mean, like, it's certainly a benefit. Like, if we're doing a list of pros and cons about why to do term limits and not, preventing people from getting fat off the public fisc is one. But you could also have the perverse incentive of encouraging people to say, crap, I'm only going to be here for a little while. It's like, I'm not going to be up in the Klondike panning gold for my whole life, so I better hurry, and I can just see, it's so character dependent. On the broader thing about term limits, I just go back and forth on it. I mean, I respect people who take your position, because there are days of the week where I take your position, but like, I still worry about I would much rather get cameras out of Congress. There are a bunch of things that I would rather do.
Here's something I know that's near and dear to your heart, Jonah, which is not in my book, but I think would help, is it's uncapping the House. I mean, I think if we had more members of Congress, that would go a long way towards solving the part of the problem where people feel like a disconnect that their member of Congress is so much richer than they are and so much more elite than they are. And I think if we had a larger House, like if we quadrupled the size of it or something like that, I think it would help this problem.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think it's worth, I mean, not to get all Yuval in here, but like it's worth asking the question, is the problem plutocracy or is the problem oligarchy? Right. And because you phrase it as congressmen who are so much richer than they are and so much more elite. And they're not necessarily the same thing. Right. And like the high status that comes from being one of 435, that was not always, you know, it was not necessarily always the case. I mean, and the problem is, and again, it's this chicken or the egg thing, right? Are they getting rich because status gives you opportunities for wealth? Or, you know, are they wealthy, which is giving them opportunities for status? And obviously it's both and, not either or. But yeah, expanding the Congress, it seems to me like it makes it less elite. It also gives the opportunity, not just in terms of that there are more of them, but it gives more people the opportunity to cycle through, right? And to be part of that, which makes it seem more accessible and less oligarchical and to some extent less plutocratic. So I don't know. I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you when you say I'm right. All right. So very quickly, I know we're going along here. And points for you if you can get filthy rich politicians into these answers. How are you feeling just generally about the GOP these days? I had a very good friend of mine whose name you would recognize, but I won't out him, who texted me this morning asking me on a 0 to 10, how much do I despair for American politics and the Republican Party these days? And I can tell you my answer later, but it was interesting hearing from him, from this person who's normally much more upbeat than I am. So where do you come down? Do you think the worst is behind us or the worst is ahead of us?
Oh, man, that is a tough question. I certainly hope the worst is behind us. But what bothers me is that it's clearly not just Donald Trump. I mean, and we always knew that, right? I mean, even in 2015, 2016 or whatever, we knew that like Donald Trump is a symptom of a problem, that we have a culture problem that led us to want Donald Trump and for Donald Trump to be successful. But I still think there was a chance that if Trump and Trumpism had sort of been humiliated and defeated, that there were multiple opportunities along the way where I thought there was a chance that we would never go back. You know, we're not going to go back to like Mitt Romney, John McCain, but that we could end up with a benign populism, you know, something like a hybrid approach where, you know, we're sort of protectionist, but we're still decent and compassionate and, you know, like a Scott Walker type situation or something like that. Right. But I do have to say that what I'm seeing like from Ron DeSantis, and I would still vote for DeSantis over Trump simply because Trump's the only person that I know who's ever tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power. But the stuff that I'm seeing from Ron DeSantis, who's by far, you know, clearly the second place, you know, if you add up Trump's 50% and DeSantis's 20 or 30% or whatever it is, that adds up. That doesn't give me hope, Jonah. And it seems to me that like you've got the Trump contingent, which is sort of like, you know, folks who go to Walmart and kind of good old boys with the rebel flags and or whatever, you know, and then you've got DeSantis, which are these like very online Blake Masters, Josh Hawley, like dark web intellectual, but very disturbed, you know, just this is to say, Jonah, I am not optimistic right now. And I do, you know, let me say something good. I like the way, I like Tim Scott. I don't like all the pandering he's had to do, but I like that he's optimistic. And I would, if he ends up being like here's how it could turn out okay. Tim Scott becomes Donald Trump's vice president. Tim Scott becomes president, right? Like, if that were to happen, maybe that's like God saving us. And, Chris Christie, he's at 3% maybe, but, he's out there plugging away.
There's a poll now. I saw him. He's at 10% in New Hampshire. That's
kind of what matters, right?
Yeah. I get so tired of it. I understand why we all pay attention to it, but the national poll thing, like, if let's just say Chris Christie won in New Hampshire, and I want to be really clear, I have been remarkably hard on Chris Christie over the last 7-8 years. And I still haven't truly forgiven him, but he's showing me something. But if Chris Christie won New Hampshire, Chris Christie would arguably become the front runner. Certainly if DeSantis won New Hampshire, I think Trump loses 30 points, because
what happens if DeSantis wins Iowa, and Christie wins New Hampshire? So Trump goes 0 for 2. I was just talking to, Mike Murphy, the Republican strategist, on my little podcast, Matt Lewis in the News.
Well done.
Thank you. I learned from Debbie. And Mike still says that Trump will not be the nominee. And I do not share his optimism, but he thinks Trump's going to go 0 for 2, and then it's off to the races.
So I have not officially rescinded my position from months ago, end of 2022, I think, that neither DeSantis nor Trump nor Biden will be the major party candidates. And I am less confident in that. I'm less confident in 2 of those 3 components than I was back then. But I have not formally rescinded my position. And I was heartened to see George Will coming in to essentially, buck me up at least on 2 of them. So we'll see. But I agree. I've said this the last 2 times I was on CNN now, but it does feel right now, and that's the important caveat, because straight line projections are stupid, but it feels right now that we are poised to repeat the 2016 mistake of nominating 2 candidates so unbelievably unpopular that they have a legitimate chance of losing to the other one. And that's no way to run a grown-up country. It's just too ancient. Everyone talks about how old Biden is. Biden's 5 years older, 6 years older, 4 years older than Trump. It's not like it's the major categorical differences in age or in craziness, to be honest. It's just Biden's presents more geriatric than Trump's does.
Oh, I think that's right. It's the Iran-Iraq war. I don't know what the analogy is, but it's not good, Bob.
I'm trying to think about a more upbeat way to end this. Let me just let do a little personal thing. Are you from West Virginia, or you just live in West Virginia?
So I'm actually from Western Maryland. My dad was a prison guard in Hagerstown for 30 years. Hagerstown, Maryland. Yeah.
I know Hagerstown.
I can tell you stories about that gig, as you can imagine. So I'm not far, so I'm from between Frederick and Hagerstown, Maryland, which is very, very close to West Virginia. I actually went to college in West Virginia in Shepherdstown, and my wife is from West Virginia. That's why we live in West Virginia. And it's pretty cool. We moved out sort of right around the time COVID was hitting, and I started coaching Little League and, joined a church out here. And for what I do, writing about politics and culture and conservatism, it's been refreshing to kind of come back to a rural area. And I think it helped me with the book, kind of with my perspective as I'm balancing kind of understanding the plight of working class folks versus, I also don't think politicians are inherently evil, and I don't think rich people are inherently bad either. So I think that the yin and the yang of having lived in DC, but also coming from and living now in West Virginia has been helpful.
Yeah, just this always surprises me how many people I end up knowing from West Virginia. I mean, obviously Chris Direwald is the head of the ex. I can't say ex West Virginian because we'll always say he is a West Virginian. But
William Sapphire, I think, had a place in Harper's Ferry, like a weekend house. Jack German, the legendary Baltimore newspaper man, McLaughlin Group guy.
Best title of a memoir maybe ever.
Fat Man in the Middle Seat.
Fat Man in the Middle Seat.
That's right. He lived in Charlestown, West Virginia, and I'm pretty sure it's solely because there's a racetrack there.
Possibly. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. I have a dear friend whose dad was a big journalist who was out there a lot for precisely those reasons, and we'll just leave it oblique. They'll know what I'm talking about.
Let the record show I've been there precisely one time in the last 5 years, and it was because that's where you had to go to get your vaccine.
Is that right?
It was amazing. Yeah.
So I think I can reveal this. Charles Murray, who's a good friend. I know that bothers some people, but suck it up. He has spent a good deal of time in Charlestown playing poker because he's a very, very good, very serious poker player. And it's like the poker table for him is what my cigar shop is for me. It's like the most democratic small D thing I do, right? Is like just a weird cross section of people. And like Charles Murray, the most notorious social scientist of the last half century, is sitting around with truck drivers and mechanics playing, Texas Hold'em, having a grand old time. He's invited me to go. I just never gotten around to it.
And whether you're going to a fishing hole or a greasy spoon diner, or like my church, the church I go to now puts the fun in fundamentalist, or whether you're at the racetrack.
Is there guitar? Do you have guitar?
You know what? Believe it or not, even though this is like a fundamentalist church, they take their music really seriously. And there is like a teen rock band that performs like once a year, but it's basically violins and really good string orchestral. It defies stereotype, really. But whether you're sort of in that world or at the casino, I think it's good to be around weird, interesting, different, diverse people and experiences. And if you're a writer, it's healthy to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I have some announcements coming down the pike on this podcast about in that regard, but that's one of the big reasons why my wife and I love driving cross country, is you realize, first of all, how little the rest of the country really gives a rat's ass about politics. And you realize just how big and fundamentally decent the country is. I mean, look, there are jerks everywhere, but like, this is a good country full of good people, and it's prettier and more and weirder than people want to believe it is.
Absolutely. And I've heard stories about people like, our friend David French and Eric Erickson, who had these experiences where like MAGA people showed up at their door and like intimidated them and stuff like that. And maybe it speaks to my like lack of fame. I'm not sure why, but for whatever reason, I have to say, like, my personal, and thank God for this, but my personal experience has been, and being around rural areas, people who I know my church voted 99% for Trump. And like, everyone's super nice. And if your car broke down in the middle of the night, they would come and fix your tire for you. And that is, I think, inspiring and uplifting. And it was after being on Twitter all day at my job, that helps heal my soul. So I'm happy to have that outlet.
All right, my friend Matt Lewis, the book is, in case you missed it, Filthy Rich Politicians. It is now available wherever your finer books are sold. Matt also has a wonderful podcast, and thanks for coming on, and hope to have you back.
Hey, the pleasure's all on this side of the table, Jonah.